The Big Picture is a platform I'm genuinely thrilled and humbled to have at my disposal, because it really is just a space for me to say basically whatever I want to in front of a big audience. I try as best as I am able to respect the responsibility that comes with that, i.e. trying to not make this just my personal soapbox or whatever happens to be bugging me at a particular moment. But sometimes something burrows into my brain and won't let go, and in the case of this week's episode, it was brought on by a Twitter exchange that prompted me to think, someone should do a show about that. Oh hey, I've got a show, and it can't always be about old obscure cartoons and bad movies. Though we'll get right back on that as soon as I can, I promise. Anyway, in all of the so-called nerd culture, gaming seems to prize its own sense of outsider stature among the most highly, a behavior which, predictably, has only increased as video games have become more mainstream and culturally ubiquitous than ever. The most amusing manifestation of this is our need to invent new, culture-specific names for things that already had perfectly good ones. For example, it used to be said that Eskimos had over 50 words for snow, but gamers have developed seemingly hundreds of words for being a jerk in multiplayer. The unnecessary gamer culture synonym that's gotten under my skin as of late, though it may not technically have been invented by gamer culture, is booth babe. Invented because somebody figured that trade show model was an insufficiently dehumanizing term. Like I said, present-day gamer culture likes to affect an even greater myopia than it actually has, so it's important to note that so-called booth babes are not and have never been our exclusive province. True, they're less ubiquitous in other fields as a fact of trade show attendees being overwhelmingly male becomes less ironclad, but there's still a good chance that the quote-unquote babes in question at this or that gaming con are ultimately going to change out of their Capcom logo half-shirts and into a shiny dress to gesture at BMWs or whatever the next show is. The fact is, regardless of whether or not or to what degree you consider the basic premise of paying pretty girls to be on hand to draw attention towards this or that display to be problematic, modeling, as in looking good, friendly, approachable in front of total strangers for extended periods, is hard work with a pretty limited shelf life, hence why the money tends to be pretty good. So honestly, booth babe is kind of a reductive and unfair way to label them and the work they do to begin with. Doubly so now that there's this ongoing backlash against them. Understand, please, I am not talking about the so-called booth babe bans in effect at PAX and other conventions. Private entities can decide to have or not have whatever they want at their shows, and honestly, I'd say that discouraging presenters from resorting to, "Hey guys, look! Boobs! Yeah, boobs! Oh, and now that we've got your attention, here's our entirely unrelated isometric puzzle platformer," is a step forward for the industry, theoretically. I mean, let's get real here. Using half-naked women to draw attention to, say, Medal of Honor or Skyrim is pretty much just sleazy pandering. But if we're talking about DOA or Lollipop Chainsaw or Bayonetta or God of War or Mortal Kombat or Duke Nukem or Dragon's Crown, you get the idea. It's really more like truth in advertising, isn't it? I mean, in the end, it almost feels like yet another manifestation of gaming's persistent desire to be seen as having grown up without actually doing much growing up. Let's lose the models so the press coverage of the show floor doesn't look so much like the Bunny Ranch, but the product can still look as much like the Bunny Ranch as it wants to. Again, nothing against people who were genuinely uncomfortable with the presence of so-called booth babes, or with conventions and shows that do adopt that policy. I'm just concerned with the mindset at play, and some of the troubling undercurrents that I feel moving through what on the surface seems like a benign or even positive attempt to class up the joint. For example, one of the most common knocks on booth babes is that they're annoying because you can tell they don't really know or care about the stuff they're shilling. Now, as awkwardly and off-putting as that can be, I don't know, there's a part of that that feels more than a little like a codified version of the whole fake geek girl thing, right? I.e. the idea that these spaces belong to men by default and any women on hand are obliged to prove that they deserve to be there. Little similar, right? Sounds familiar? Yes? No? Either way, that brings up a whole other can of worms that's been opened up by the subject. Part of the well-intentioned impetus behind the anti-booth babe angle was to make conventions, trade shows, press events, etc. more inclusive spaces for women, but it feels like the opposite of that has cropped up as an unintended consequence. With booth babe, already a not terribly nice way to refer to professional models, has become yet another shorthand with which to marginalize all other women in the business and or community. How many times have you heard glorified booth babe tossed off as an insult to this or that person, huh? Hell, I'm pretty sure I've used it a few times in weaker, less creative moments. And I've heard from more than a few women who work in the gaming, geek, and convention circuit space that they feel like they have to somehow dress down or otherwise downplay their own appearance, attractiveness, whatever, in order to avoid getting slapped with the booth babe label and not taken seriously. What started as a cheeky nickname for the hired eye candy has been converted into yet another bit of casually sexist invective to toss around in the convention circuit, often to the, intentional or not, diminishment of people working at booths or presentations who happen to be women and actually are there in an official capacity and do know what they're selling. And that's not cool. You gotta love the way sexism works in this scene, huh? Not conventionally pretty, you're gonna get ignored or teased. If you are conventionally pretty, you're probably fake and you don't belong here. I mean, what the I don't even have big fancy words for that. That whole scenario just sucks. I understand why so much of gaming culture decided that it didn't like so-called booth babes. Their presence is a symbol of how little the games industry actually thinks of its consumers, how easily we can be pandered to and won over. But as is so often the case, it kind of feels like we might have gone after a symptom instead of treating the disease. Since that might have entailed being introspective and critical about stuff, we're not quite willing to explore that deeply just yet. As for the extra wrinkle of misogyny that seems to have been injected into a community that was already pruny with the stuff by all the stumbling and bumbling around this issue, I don't know how we'd even start to fix that, to be honest, but here's an idea. Maybe we could wean ourselves off of booth babes as a word in general, maybe just relearn to call and think of them as models, or spokespersons, or booth workers, whatever capacity they're there in, or God forbid, as people? Just a thought. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.